Don't touch me. People like you should know their place. The words landed harder than the crystal wineglass Ethan Whitmore had just knocked over. For one suspended heartbeat, the entire grand ballroom of the Sterling Room seemed to stop breathing. Forks froze halfway to designer plates. Conversations dissolved into silence. Even the soft piano drifting from the corner stage faltered as dozens of heads slowly turned toward the center table where one of America's youngest billionaire CEOs sat glaring at a waitress as though she had personally ruined his evening. Naomi Carter stood perfectly still, a linen napkin folded neatly in her hand, a few drops of Bordeaux staining the cuff of her black uniform. She did not flinch. She did not apologize again. She simply lowered her eyes and stepped back. Around her, executives worth hundreds of millions shifted uncomfortably in their seats, careful not to attract attention. No one challenged Ethan Whitmore. Almost no one ever did. At 39, Ethan had built Whitmore Ventures into a multi-billion-dollar investment empire headquartered in Manhattan. Business magazines called him visionary. Financial reporters called him ruthless. Competitors called him untouchable. Tonight, inside one of Chicago's most exclusive restaurants, he was preparing to close the largest deal of his career, a $2.4 billion partnership that could expand his company across 3 continents. The guest list reflected that ambition. Senators, venture capitalists, media executives, and international investors filled the room beneath chandeliers that glittered like frozen waterfalls. Every detail had been engineered for power. Every seat had been assigned with precision. Every camera had been carefully positioned. And yet the moment everyone would remember had nothing to do with contracts or money. It involved a waitress no one had noticed 30 seconds earlier. Naomi Carter had only started working at the Sterling Room 3 weeks before. She arrived early, left late, and rarely spoke unless spoken to. Her coworkers described her as calm, almost unusually calm, as if chaos simply moved around her instead of through her. Guests remembered her warm professionalism, but little else. In places like this, people often forgot waitstaff existed. Naomi seemed perfectly comfortable with that arrangement. She moved quietly between tables, refilling glasses, clearing plates, observing everything. Especially tonight. Because tonight felt different. The tension in the room was impossible to ignore. Billion-dollar negotiations have a sound. It lives beneath polite laughter and expensive jazz. It lingers inside careful smiles and measured handshakes. Naomi recognized it immediately. So did Ethan. Unfortunately, Ethan recognized something else as well. Weakness. Or at least what he believed was weakness. As Naomi turned to leave, Ethan straightened his custom tuxedo and muttered loudly enough for half the table to hear, maybe next time they should hire staff who understand high-level events. A few uneasy chuckles escaped around the table. Naomi paused for exactly 1 second. Then she continued walking. She never looked back. What Ethan Whitmore did not know, what no one inside that glittering ballroom could possibly have known, was that he had just humiliated the one person capable of changing the course of his entire future. Naomi disappeared through the service doors without changing her expression, but the atmosphere inside the Sterling Room never fully recovered. Guests returned to their conversations, yet the energy had shifted. It was subtle at first. Voices grew quieter. Smiles became more cautious. Several investors exchanged glances across the room, silently acknowledging what everyone had witnessed, but few dared discuss. Ethan Whitmore noticed it immediately, and he hated it. He had spent years controlling rooms exactly like this one. He knew how influence worked. Confidence attracted money. Weakness repelled it. Public discomfort was weakness. He loosened the cuff of his tailored jacket and forced a polished smile back onto his face. Now, he announced, lifting his glass, let us focus on why we are all here tonight. A few people nodded politely. Others followed his lead. The evening slowly resumed. Across the ballroom, Naomi entered the staff corridor carrying an empty silver tray. The noise of the dining room faded behind the heavy kitchen doors. Steam rose from industrial ovens. Chefs shouted orders. Plates clattered. Yet Naomi remained composed. You okay? asked Maria Sanchez, another server who had witnessed the exchange from nearby. Naomi offered a small smile. I am fine. Maria frowned. Most people would not be. Naomi carefully folded the stained napkin and placed it beside the service station. Most people are not me. Maria studied her for a moment before shaking her head. I still do not understand you. Naomi simply returned to work. 30 minutes later, the evening reached its most important moment. A private investor delegation from Boston had finally arrived. Their participation represented nearly $800 million of the proposed deal. Ethan straightened immediately as the distinguished guests entered the ballroom. This was the group he needed most. Their lead representative, 70-year-old financier Arthur Sinclair, rarely invested without personally evaluating executive leadership. Securing his approval would transform Whitmore Ventures forever. Ethan greeted the delegation with practiced charm. Handshakes were exchanged. Expensive bourbon was poured. Laughter returned. For the first time that evening, Ethan believed the night was back under control. Then something unexpected happened. While distributing menus, Naomi quietly approached the investor table. Before she could set down the final menu, Arthur Sinclair looked up. His expression changed instantly. Confusion appeared first, then recognition, then something remarkably close to delight. Naomi, he said softly. Naomi stopped. For the first time all evening, genuine surprise crossed her face. Good evening, Mr. Sinclair, she replied politely. The elderly billionaire slowly rose from his chair. Several guests watched in confusion as one of the most influential investors in America smiled warmly at a waitress. I cannot believe it, Arthur said. After all these years of all places. The surrounding conversations faded once again. Ethan stared across the table, uncertain what he was seeing. Arthur Sinclair was known throughout Wall Street for his reserve. The man barely smiled during billion-dollar negotiations. Yet here he stood, beaming at a waitress Ethan had dismissed less than an hour earlier. Naomi maintained her professional composure. It is good to see you again, sir, she said. Arthur laughed softly. You always did insist on being impossible to predict. Around them, curiosity spread through the ballroom like wildfire. And for the first time that night, Ethan Whitmore began to wonder if he had misjudged the quiet woman in the black uniform. The silence surrounding Arthur Sinclair and Naomi Carter lasted only a few seconds, but inside the Sterling room, it felt much longer. Executives who had spent decades navigating boardrooms suddenly found themselves watching a conversation they did not understand. Arthur motioned toward an empty chair near his table. Would you have a few minutes after your shift? He asked warmly. There is someone I would very much like you to meet. Naomi smiled politely. If management approves, I would be honored. Arthur nodded, clearly satisfied. Excellent. It has been far too long. As Naomi quietly resumed serving guests, whispers immediately spread across the ballroom. Investors leaned toward one another. Phones discreetly appeared beneath tables. Curiosity had replaced small talk. Ethan Whitmore remained seated, his expression carefully controlled, but inside, questions were beginning to multiply. He had spent years studying people. Reading people was one of the reasons he had become a billionaire before 40. Yet Naomi Carter made no sense. Waitresses did not casually exchange greetings with Arthur Sinclair. They certainly did not inspire that kind of genuine affection from a man famous for trusting almost no one. Ethan watched as Naomi moved gracefully between tables. Nothing about her behavior had changed. She still carried trays. She still thanked guests with the same calm professionalism. She still avoided unnecessary attention. And somehow, that only made her more intriguing. Do you know her? Ethan quietly asked one of Arthur's associates seated nearby. The older executive shook his head. No, but if Arthur knows her, she is important. The answer unsettled Ethan more than he expected. Meanwhile, beyond the glittering ballroom, another world existed entirely. Earlier that same morning, before stepping into her black uniform, Naomi had awakened at 5:30 inside a modest brick townhouse on the south side of Chicago. The house was comfortable but simple. No marble floors. No private drivers. No luxury. Just warm light, family photographs, shelves filled with books, and a kitchen where Naomi prepared breakfast while reviewing nonprofit grant applications on her laptop. Every Tuesday and Thursday before work, she volunteered at a community learning center less than 2 miles away, mentoring high school students interested in business and entrepreneurship. Most of the students had no idea where she had gone to college. Naomi never mentioned it. She preferred listening to talking. Her life followed routines built around purpose rather than status. Service was not something she performed. It was something she believed in. Years earlier, she had learned that titles often revealed less about character than people imagined. That lesson had changed everything. Back inside the Sterling room, the first signs of trouble appeared shortly after dessert arrived. During final contract discussions, one of Ethan's senior analysts projected updated financial models onto a massive presentation screen. Numbers filled the room. Revenue forecasts. International expansion costs. Acquisition timelines. Billion-dollar decisions hidden inside spreadsheets. Ethan spoke confidently as investors listened. Then, while refilling Arthur Sinclair's coffee, Naomi glanced toward the presentation screen for only a moment. Her eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. She said nothing, at least not immediately. But as she stepped away from the table, Arthur noticed the expression on her face. And that expression concerned him far more than any number displayed on the screen. Arthur Sinclair did not interrupt the presentation immediately. He simply watched Naomi disappear toward the service station, then shifted his attention back to the massive screen glowing at the front of the ballroom. Ethan Whitmore stood beside it with complete confidence, moving effortlessly through charts and projections worth billions of dollars. As you can see, Ethan said smoothly, our Southeast Asia expansion is expected to generate a 32% increase in annual revenue within 18 months. Several investors nodded while assistants typed notes onto tablets. The numbers were impressive. On paper, everything looked flawless. But Arthur had spent 50 years building fortunes. He trusted instincts almost as much as spreadsheets. And Naomi's expression had troubled him. Across the room, Naomi stood near the espresso station preparing coffee service. Her face remained calm, yet her eyes kept returning to the presentation screen. Finally, Arthur quietly excused himself from the table and approached her. You saw something, he said softly. Naomi hesitated. It is probably nothing. Arthur smiled knowingly. You have never said those words and meant them. Naomi exhaled slowly. Slide 14. The international licensing costs are duplicated. Arthur frowned. Duplicated? Naomi nodded. The same acquisition expense appears in both the operating costs and the expansion reserve. It inflates projected expenses by nearly $180 million over 3 years. Arthur stared at her for several seconds. Are you certain? Naomi looked back toward the screen. I would need to review the underlying documents to confirm. But I am fairly certain. Arthur did not respond immediately. Instead, he studied the presentation once more. Then, without warning, he turned and walked directly toward Ethan. Conversation softened as the legendary investor approached the center stage. Ethan, Arthur said calmly, would you mind revisiting slide 14? Ethan paused, surprised. Of course. Is there a concern? Arthur folded his hands. Perhaps. I would like clarification regarding your licensing allocations. A faint crease appeared on Ethan's forehead. His analysts quickly advanced the presentation backward. Numbers reappeared on the giant screen. Ethan reviewed them confidently. Everything has been independently audited, he assured the room. Arthur remained composed. Even so, I would appreciate another look. The lead financial analyst began reviewing the figures in real time. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Then his expression changed. He adjusted his glasses. Scrolled again. Checked supporting files. The color slowly drained from his face. A murmur spread across the ballroom. There appears to be an error, the analyst admitted quietly. The licensing expenses have been entered twice. Silence. Thick. Immediate. Several investors straightened in their seats. Others exchanged alarmed glances. Ethan stared at the screen in disbelief. The duplicated figure represented $183 million. Not enough to destroy the deal, but more than enough to raise serious questions about oversight and leadership. Ethan recovered quickly. "We will correct the discrepancy immediately," he said. "Fortunately, it does not materially affect long-term projections." Arthur nodded politely. "That is true." Then he added, almost casually, "A member of your staff noticed it moments ago." Ethan looked confused. "Which analyst?" Arthur turned toward the service area. Every eye in the room followed. Naomi Carter stood frozen beside the coffee station, silver tray still in her hands. The entire ballroom suddenly understood that the quiet waitress was not who she appeared to be. No one moved for several seconds. The ballroom simply stared. Naomi Carter stood beside the coffee station, suddenly illuminated by the glow of 100 curious eyes. The silver tray in her hands now seemed almost symbolic. Minutes earlier, she had been invisible. Now she had become the center of a room filled with people who controlled companies, markets, and fortunes. Ethan Whitmore felt the shift immediately. Power had moved. Not completely. Not yet. But enough to unsettle him. "Miss Carter," Ethan said, forcing a diplomatic smile, "it appears we owe you our thanks." His voice was polished, practiced, perfect for investors. Naomi inclined her head politely. "I was simply doing my job, sir." The answer was respectful. Yet something about it bothered Ethan. Perhaps it was the calmness. Perhaps it was the complete absence of triumph. Most people, after exposing a $183 million error in front of billionaires, would have enjoyed the moment. Naomi did not. She simply returned to serving coffee. Arthur Sinclair watched the exchange carefully. He had seen this before. He knew what quiet confidence looked like. He also knew Ethan was beginning to realize he had badly misjudged someone. Dinner resumed, although the atmosphere had changed beyond repair. The financial discussion continued, but attention drifted repeatedly toward Naomi. Guests whispered behind raised glasses. Several investors discreetly searched her name online. Nothing appeared. No social media. No interviews. No professional biography. Almost nothing at all. The mystery only deepened. Later, as dessert plates were being cleared, Ethan approached Naomi near the service entrance. "You have a background in finance?" he asked. Naomi placed a stack of plates onto her tray. "A little." Ethan frowned. A little does not usually catch a 9-figure accounting discrepancy from 30 feet away. Naomi offered the faintest smile. "Numbers tell stories. I have always enjoyed listening." Ethan studied her. "Where did you study?" For the first time all evening, Naomi hesitated. "Different places." The answer felt intentionally incomplete. Before Ethan could ask another question, Arthur Sinclair appeared beside them. "Actually," Arthur said warmly, "Naomi studied at Wharton." Ethan blinked. "The Wharton School?" Arthur nodded. "Graduated at the top of her class." Silence settled between them. Even the nearby servers paused. Ethan looked at Naomi, waiting for confirmation. She simply nodded once. "That was a long time ago." Ethan struggled to hide his surprise. "Then why are you working here?" Naomi looked across the ballroom where guests laughed beneath chandeliers worth more than most homes. "Because titles are temporary. Character is not." Arthur smiled quietly. That philosophy is precisely why she was selected. Ethan turned sharply. "Selected for what?" Arthur's expression changed. The warmth remained, but something else appeared beneath it. "Authority." "I suppose there is no reason to keep it private any longer," he said. "Naomi is not simply a waitress at this restaurant." Arthur paused just long enough for every nearby conversation to die. "She is one of the newest members of the Sinclair Foundation Board, and she was personally assigned to evaluate leadership culture among several companies receiving consideration for our expansion fund." Ethan felt the air leave his lungs. The expansion fund represented nearly $800 million. And the woman he had publicly humiliated was one of the people helping decide where that money would go. The world did not end with a shout. It ended with silence. Thick, suffocating silence. The kind that settles over a room when truth arrives uninvited. Ethan Whitmore stood motionless beside the service entrance, his carefully crafted confidence cracking beneath the weight of a single revelation. Around him, conversations had completely stopped. The investors who had spent the evening competing for influence were no longer looking at quarterly projections or expansion strategies. They were looking at Naomi, the waitress. The woman Ethan had dismissed, corrected, and publicly humiliated less than 2 hours earlier. Across the ballroom, several guests slowly lowered their phones. Others discreetly raised them. Moments like this had a way of traveling far beyond luxury dining rooms. Ethan finally found his voice. "You were evaluating us?" he asked quietly. Naomi met his eyes for the first time that evening. Her expression remained calm. "Not just your company," she said. "Several organizations receiving consideration from the Sinclair Foundation." Ethan swallowed. "And working here was part of that evaluation?" Arthur Sinclair answered before Naomi could. "The foundation believes leadership cannot be measured inside boardrooms alone. People reveal their character when they think no one important is watching." The words landed with surgical precision. Several executives shifted uncomfortably. They understood exactly what Arthur was saying. So did Ethan. Every dismissive comment, every condescending glance, every careless assumption. Suddenly, they no longer felt small. They felt enormous. Ethan looked around the ballroom. He noticed things he had ignored all evening. The uneasy expressions. The investors avoiding eye contact. The senior partners whispering among themselves. He had spent decades mastering negotiations, yet somehow he had failed the simplest test imaginable. How do you treat another human being? Arthur slowly returned to his seat. "The financial projections can be corrected," he said calmly. "Character assessments are considerably more difficult." No one spoke. The jazz pianist quietly stopped playing altogether. Somewhere in the distance, silverware clinked against fine china, sounding strangely loud in the silence. Ethan turned back toward Naomi. "Why did you not tell me?" he asked. Naomi looked genuinely puzzled. Would it have changed anything? The question pierced deeper than any accusation could have. Ethan opened his mouth, then stopped. Because he did not know the answer. And that terrified him. For the first time in years, Ethan Whitmore found himself confronting something money could not fix immediately. Himself. Naomi gently placed the empty coffee pot onto a nearby service cart. "People deserve dignity before introductions," she said softly. "Not after." A few guests lowered their heads. Others nodded almost imperceptibly. Because everyone in that room understood the truth inside those words. This was no longer about a business deal. It was about values. About humanity. About the invisible lines separating power from arrogance. Later that evening, as investors prepared to leave, Arthur Sinclair requested a private meeting with his delegation. The discussion lasted 43 minutes behind closed doors. No one outside the room knew exactly what was said. But when the doors finally opened, every face looked serious. And Ethan suddenly realized that the future of Whitmore Ventures was no longer in his hands. The answer arrived 3 days later at exactly 8:17 on a rainy Tuesday morning. Ethan Whitmore was standing inside the 42nd floor boardroom of Whitmore Ventures when his chief legal officer entered carrying a sealed envelope. One look at her expression told him everything. The room, lined with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking downtown Chicago, suddenly felt much smaller. "The Sinclair Foundation has made its decision," she said quietly. Ethan opened the envelope himself. He read the letter once. Then again. Then a third time. The words did not change. The foundation was withdrawing from the proposed partnership. $800 million in funding had vanished with the signature at the bottom of a single page. The official explanation cited concerns regarding organizational culture and executive leadership values. No further details were provided. Silence settled over the boardroom. Several executives looked stunned. Others looked unsurprised. Because the truth was that many of them had witnessed Ethan's behavior for years. They had simply benefited from it. Until now. Financial news outlets learned about the collapsed deal before lunch. By late afternoon, analysts were speculating openly. Why would Arthur Sinclair abandon one of the most promising technology expansions in years? Rumors spread quickly. Then came the video. Someone attending the dinner had recorded Ethan's interaction with Naomi. The clip lasted only 23 seconds. 23 seconds of arrogance. 23 seconds of public humiliation. 23 seconds capable of damaging a reputation built over decades. By evening, millions of people had watched it online. Comment sections exploded. Former employees began sharing stories of dismissive treatment and hostile workplace culture. Business journalists revisited old interviews. Leadership experts debated corporate accountability on national television. Whitmore Ventures stock fell nearly 11% within 48 hours. Investors demanded answers. Board members demanded change. For perhaps the first time in his professional life, Ethan Whitmore could not control the narrative. Yet the most painful consequence was not financial. It was personal. Ethan found himself replaying that evening repeatedly. Not the lost funding. Not the headlines. Naomi's question. Would it have changed anything? The words followed him everywhere. During meetings. During sleepless nights. During lonely dinners inside his penthouse overlooking Lake Michigan. He remembered how quickly he had judged her. How effortlessly he had assumed superiority. He remembered that he had never even asked her name before insulting her. That realization haunted him. Because this was never truly about Naomi. It was about the person Ethan had become while chasing success. 6 weeks later, the Whitmore Ventures board announced sweeping reforms. Mandatory leadership training. New employee feedback systems. Diversity initiatives with independent oversight. Several senior executives quietly resigned. Ethan himself stepped away from daily operations for a temporary leave of absence. The business world called it strategic restructuring. But those closest to him knew better. Ethan Whitmore was learning a lesson no business school had ever taught him. Respect is not something granted to powerful people. It is something powerful people owe everyone. And somewhere on the south side of Chicago, Naomi Carter continued mentoring students, serving meals, and changing lives exactly as she had before. Because true character does not appear when cameras are watching. It appears when no one is looking. 3 months later, on a cold Saturday morning in early November, Ethan Whitmore stood outside a modest brick community center on the south side of Chicago holding a cardboard box filled with donated laptops. There were no cameras. No reporters. No shareholders. The man who once measured success in stock prices and acquisition targets now found himself nervously adjusting the sleeves of a plain navy sweater while children laughed somewhere inside the building. A handwritten sign taped to the front door read, Carter Community Leadership Initiative. Ethan stared at it for several seconds before finally walking inside. The center buzzed with life. Teenagers worked in small groups around folding tables. Whiteboards covered the walls. The scent of coffee and fresh pastries drifted through the hallway. Hope lived here. You could feel it. At the far end of the room, Naomi Carter stood beside a projector explaining entrepreneurship principles to a group of high school students. She wore jeans, sneakers, and a simple blue sweater. No uniform. No silver tray. Yet somehow she looked exactly the same. Calm. Grounded. Unshaken. One of the students noticed. Ethan first. Whispers spread across the room. Naomi turned. For a brief moment, surprise crossed her face. Then she smiled politely. Mr. Whitmore. Ethan nodded awkwardly. I called ahead. Your assistant said volunteers were welcome. Naomi glanced toward the cardboard box in his hands. Looks like you came prepared. Ethan looked down. I had some equipment sitting in storage. I thought your students might be able to use it. Naomi walked over and opened the box. Inside sat 20 brand new laptops. Several students gasped. This is incredibly generous, she said softly. Ethan shook his head. No, this is overdue. Silence settled between them. Not uncomfortable, just honest. The kind of silence that appears when pride finally leaves the room. After class ended, Naomi invited Ethan to stay for lunch. They sat together at a small cafeteria table while students moved around them. There were no billion-dollar negotiations. No luxury chandeliers. No investors. Just two people sharing sandwiches in a community center. Eventually Ethan spoke. I owe you an apology. Naomi listened quietly. Not because of the deal, Ethan continued. Not because of the headlines. Because I looked at you and decided who you were before learning anything about you. And the truth is, I did that to a lot of people. Naomi studied him for a moment. What matters is what you do after you recognize it. Ethan nodded slowly. I am trying. Naomi smiled. I know. Across the room, a young student raised his hand. Miss Carter, can Mr. Whitmore help us with the business simulation? Naomi looked toward Ethan. For the first time in months, he laughed. A real laugh. Unrehearsed. I think I can manage that, he said. And as he walked toward a table filled with ambitious teenagers, Ethan finally understood something that had taken him nearly 40 years to learn. Wealth can open doors. Power can command attention. But neither can earn respect. Respect is built in the quiet moments, in the unseen choices, in the simple decision to honor another person's dignity before knowing what they can offer in return. He had entered the Sterling room believing he owned the room. He left understanding. That grace, not money, is the rarest form of power. This was a black story. A human story. And in the end, humanity won.